With today's tutorial, we're going to get ourselves back into Photoshop. If you're having trouble remembering some things from last term, hopefully this will be some review. I'll try to go over a few things that will certainly be review, trying to think back to what we did last term. But today we're going to start back into Photoshop using the Smart Objects feature. So in your tutorial package, you're given all of the resources and you're given the step-by-step on the tutorial. So I'm just going to go through here and show you what was in that folder. So you're going to have the this is the finished version, so you'll actually see it here as a PNG. So that's what you're going for. Obviously yours can be a little different. In fact, I encourage you to play around and do something different. If you want to do something more creative, bring in some different components, that's great. However, you do want to work through the step-by-step and make sure that you go through the steps, but also don't hesitate to play. Don't hesitate to see, when you come into one section of Photoshop, don't hesitate to see, well, what will this do if I click that or move that or drag that? And remember, you always have Command Z to do undo, so you can have a little fun with this. Here's the step-by-step, so you'll have that. You'll want to have that open to refer to. As always, when I go through these tutorials, I will do things in some cases a little different that will hopefully be even more helpful for you. However, all of the steps in here will work, but there will be a couple of amendments I'll make as we go. So this is a tutorial that I received, so I didn't write this, and in order to just show you the way I work, I like to take what steps we have here, and sometimes I'll elaborate on them just to give you a couple of extra tips and tricks. So this is what you'll follow. And you've been given the images that have butterflies in them, obviously. So there's a few here. And you've been given the base image, which is a forest, and another butterfly there. And then I've also included for you a pen tools, kind of a how-to. Now this is, the pen tool is a tool that if you can learn it in any one of the three programs, InDesign, Illustrator, and Photoshop, it is highly valuable to know. And if you've learned it in one, you've essentially learned it in each. I can't recall if we talked about the pen tool too much in our Illustrator tutorial. I think we may have. However, it takes some practice to learn. In my classes last term, we touched on it. You may have touched on it yourselves in last term or previous classes. However, I'll talk about that in terms of selecting objects out. It's what we use really in Photoshop to make very accurate selections of objects, which is called close cropping. So we'll talk a bit about that. And I also gave you, although this is a little dated by a couple of versions, it is still relevant in pretty much every case of key command, but it's a key command sheet. So I always encourage you guys to use the key commands. If you find you're doing something frequently, going up to a menu or looking for a function, there's probably a key command that you can use. Some of them are long. Some of them you almost have to be a guitar player to do them. However, the ones that I use most frequently they're quite simple. We always have our hand on the mouse and the other hand on the lower corner of the keyboard. And key commands are definitely part of working efficiently, but also using the program fluidly, allowing you to even more so control it rather than it control you. So I really do encourage you to use the key commands. I know dozens myself throughout all the programs I use, and it gets to the point where if you can remember where a function is in the menus, you can probably remember the key command that's associated with it. And in those menus, you will see next to whatever function you're doing, you'll see that the key command is there, and give it a try. That becomes a fantastic way to use, especially these creative programs. Okay, so we're going to get started. We're going to just, I'm going to go through the steps. Hopefully this won't take too long, but like I said, I do like to expand on a few things when I can. So I'm first going to get that forest image open. Okay, so here again is our final. That's kind of what we're going for. And this is our base. So immediately you can see some differences, right? You can see the brightness is brought up, the lightness, and so on. And one thing I'm going to talk about that the tutorial doesn't necessarily discuss is what's called destructive and non-destructive editing. So we talked about this in my class last term. If you weren't in my class last term, I'm going to assume you probably discussed destructive and non-destructive. So I will talk about that as we go through. But the main aspect of this tutorial is in regard to smart objects. Now, smart objects can be a tricky thing in the sense that what they're really doing is maintaining the quality of whatever you bring in throughout certain scaling and copying and size usage and so on. But it's especially useful for vector artwork. So smart objects really are a vector-based function in the program. And vector art, Illustrator art, for example, we know that when we're in Illustrator working on our logos, we can zoom in as close as we want and we can zoom out as far as we want, and or make the object as small or as large as we'd like, and it will always retain that clarity on the edges, and it's in the effects that have been applied and so on. That's because vector art is that line art. It's based on the anchor points. Where in Photoshop, we're working with rasterized artwork. So once something has been rasterized already, in a sense, it's lost really all of its functionality as a smart object. However, you can still create a smart object from a rasterized component, such as in this case, the background or a butterfly and so on. And then it will retain whatever resolution it had while you make various changes to it. So smart objects, again, as you get better with Photoshop, you'll become much more adept at how they work and why you might be using them. But I would say a great thing to consider when you're bringing a vector component, anything from Illustrator, into your project. So I'm going to do a little example here for you. It's great to bring something in as a vector or as a smart object in order to retain that clarity until you're ready to convert it to a rasterized layer. Now, the other thing with that is that when you use smart objects, they are they're not necessarily able to do all functions. I'm actually going to make a circle here because we'll see a little better. They're not going to be able to do all functions that this is a fake logo, obviously, and as I was saying, smart objects can't perform all functions that Photoshop offers because Photoshop is a raster-based program. We simply at some point have to convert a layer to a rasterized layer in order to take use those functions that Photoshop offers. So I'm just going to paste this in. I sampled that, and you'll see that it gives us the option of smart objects, pixels, path, or shape layer. I won't go into these right now. However, when we choose smart object, what that's going to do is maintain the vector quality or the vector aspects of that file. So I'll say smart object. It's going to take a moment here. Okay, so I brought that in. I'm going to just press return and set it in. And now when I zoom in on it, this is where smart objects gets tricky. Remember that Photoshop is a rasterized, a raster-based program. So it knows only to show you in pixels. However, we brought this vector art in as a smart object, and you can see it's called a vector smart object. So we brought it in as a smart object. So even though we can see when we zoom right in, it's fuzzy, it's showing the pixels, we can size that. So I'm just going to do Command 0 here, Command T to get the bounding box, and I'm going to scale it up. Press return again, and it's still retaining its clarity. So you can see we still have to zoom in a lot to get the rasterization, the fuzziness to it. Now I'll show you the difference if I paste that in as a pixel. Turn this one off, paste, I'll choose pixels, return, I'll zoom in, so this is what we saw earlier. Now if I size this up, Command T, you can see it gets fuzzy right away. We don't have to zoom in very far to notice that it's lost that crisp edge. So when we compare the two, that's what smart objects is fantastic for. It's so useful when you're bringing in brand components and logos and of course vector illustration and so on into a rasterized environment such as Photoshop, and you're not yet ready to change the use effects, use Photoshop effects. Once you have to set that into the image through effects or different components of Photoshop, then what you're going to have to do. So actually, I'll try and give you an example here. So you can see I'm going to get rid of the rasterized one, the pixel one. So this is still our vector smart object. So for example, if I wanted to just make this bright white, I don't want to, I just want to do it kind of the quick way. I would go to Image and Adjustments, and I can go Hue Saturation and make it bright white. And that will retain the vector. But if I want to go to a filter, for example, you'll see that a lot of my filters, such as if I go to, things like, let's see, I don't use filters too much, but we'll try a lens flare. It'll do it, but what it's going to do, and you should use lens flares very carefully, but I'm just showing you with one. It's very subtle. What it does is it puts them in under the file. It doesn't do it to the layer, and even the hue saturation that I did, there's our lens flare. The hue saturation put it under into the nest of that vector object layer. So now if I wanted to do further things with this, various things are going to nest them in, but eventually I may have to rasterize this layer. There's going to be a point where some things can't be done, like all of this. You can't do all of that because it's a smart object. So I would have to rasterize it. Like I said, some functions will be grayed out if you see things grayed out, like lens blur, for example. That's only going to work on a raster. Most of these now work. It used to be that when we did smart objects, we could barely do any of this. So that was before they had the nesting. So it becomes useful, but again, you're going to have a few things that you can't do. So that's where you would select that layer, go to the flyout layer, or right click and choose rasterize. So we'll see what happens when we rasterize this smart object. You can see that it absorbed everything that we did to it. It maintained it, but now there's no editing. There's no going back to do any revisions on those items. Okay, so you just have to take time as you get to know the program more and more. You begin to understand when you should and should not use smart objects, but also it becomes a preference too. Like I said, if I'm bringing in a logo, I'll typically bring it in as a smart object in order to give me that flexibility, especially with size, so that I don't make it too large and then I want to go back small again and so on. You go back and forth and you're just over and over downgrading the quality of the logo, the clarity of it, when you're not using it as a smart object. Now, once you combine things, that's when the smart objects go out the window again. You're combining layers. That's a Photoshop thing saying, okay, well, we're going to have to rasterize this. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that. And it's good to, play around, copy and paste a logo in to see how it works. Use some Illustrator elements, bring them in and see how they work and so on. So I'm going to go through the steps here on the tutorial that you have. And the first thing is, of course, like it says, preparing the background. So we're going to actually convert this. I'm just going to double click on it first and unlock it, give it a name, and I'm going to go to convert to smart object. So you can see when you see that little icon down in the corner of the thumbnail on that layer, that's indicating that's a smart object. Now, it really hasn't changed anything on it per se, because it started as a rasterized image. It started out of not as a smart object. So we're kind of doing a little bit of trickery with it because we're saying it's a smart object when it never has been before. So that's a little bit of a difference. And we're going to name that. So double click on the name and just put forest. And I could have done that when I unlocked the layer, but that's okay. And I would say, it really is important to name your layers, especially when you're working with a document where you're going to have many layers. Sometimes in my work, I can have layers. If I'm designing a book cover, if I'm designing some special aspect of packaging or anything, I can have dozens of layers quite quickly. And if I don't name them, of course, I can find the layer. But if I don't name them and group them and so on, my document just becomes a mess. And then if a coworker has to work on it, they go in and they have no idea what's going on. So naming your layers, but also remaining organized in your layers palette is definitely important. Okay, so we are going to make a copy. Now, I use the key commands all the time when I'm working in the layers. Well, I say all the time, but there's really only a few that I would do frequently. So Command J is to make a copy. Command E will merge layers, and there's certainly others. So you can make a copy by dragging to the new layer icon, or you can just do Command J, and that will copy it. Okay, so there's your forest copy, and then we're going to apply a Gaussian blur to this copy. So we'll go up to Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur, and we're going to type 5, And what that's going to do, you can see it's just going to fuzz over this image. Anytime you see preview, we talk about this in all the programs, anytime you see preview, select that. It's going to show you what's going to happen before you click OK. So there's 5. And then in the layer mode, right up here where it says normal, so we'll actually see here, you can see that's quite a difference. Just a 5 pixel blur really can mess up a nice image. So we'll choose layer mode, and we're going to go to overlay. Now this is great. I loved when they brought this into Photoshop. It's been a few versions, but I've worked with Photoshop for so many years that it seems like forever that we worked with it without this. So you can see that it's changing with what I'm scrolling over. It used to be we had to choose one, see that it wasn't good, click undo, choose the next, click undo, and so on. It was a pain. So this is great. So we're going to write down to overlay. And what overlay is going to do, it's going to adapt the blur to this, a little bit of that blur to this background, to the original black background layer. But again, play around. You don't have to use overlay. You can use another. You can work with any of these. I would say we're trying to go for a little more of realistic look, so you're probably not going to get into these. However, I'm going to choose overlay. And then you will probably want to pull your opacity back here. So again, we're on that layer and you can see what it's doing. So we converted this to a smart object, and the reason was because this allows continued editing on that image layer. So working with a smart object is helpful that way, because I can go back to this and I can adjust any aspect of that layer. I can click on here, adjust the radius of the blur, and so on. So that editability is so important, because when we do something directly to a layer that is not a smart object, that's called destructive editing. And it's destructive because there's no going back. So we'll see a couple of other examples of destructive versus non-destructive. So a good Photoshop user will make as many edits as possible in a way that allows for those edits to be revised. Not in a way that you just make the edit and hope it works out, because there's no going back on that. We used to, before we had multiple undos, and before we had smart objects and adjustment layers, like the earliest versions of Photoshop were quite limited. So you better hope you like what you did, or else you got to start from scratch right from the beginning. So what we would often do is create copy layers, and I still do it as a habit. I create a copy layer because I'm afraid that I'm going to do something that I can't go back to my original with. Okay, so that's a great thing about the smart objects. It really helps us with editability. So I'm going to pull this opacity back a bit on the main image there. So we get a little bit of that fuzziness, but also we're still maintaining some of the effect we just did. Now I'm going to show you another thing that I like to do. I'm going to put this opacity up for a moment, and I'm going to put a mask on this. So I was selected on that layer and I clicked mask. Now I'm going to go to my brush, and it's just a soft round brush, so I'm going to increase the size of this. I'm using my right square bracket there to increase the brush size, and of course you can go up here and increase it. And when you make a mask, a layer mask, a basic layer mask like that, it comes in as white. So the opposite of white is black. So think of it as when you wear a mask, you're putting holes in the mask so that you can see what's behind it, the eyes, for example. So we need to make sure we're clicked on the mask. Right now I'm clicked on the layer, now I'm clicked on the mask. So then with that black brush, watch what happens in my mask and watch what happens on my document. So I click that, I lighten that up. I'll just be a little more extreme here. So you can see what I've done there is I haven't erased anything of this layer, I've hidden some of that blurred aspect. So I could have even done that a little different. I could go around the edges and have the center part of that blurred, where the where the light is. So we're still utilizing some of what we did with this blur, but we're poking through to the more clear aspect of that image. So now when I want to get rid of this mask, actually I'll show you for a moment, one of the great things about masks is that you can put back some of what you took away. So if I took away so much of that and I'm like, oh, I want to put some of that back, I'm going to switch back to white. Down over here with that little arrow, my brush is now going to paint white onto the mask, making sure I'm clicked on that mask, and then I can put some back. So if I thought, oh, I just took too much away, I'm adding white back into that mask. So I'm going to get rid of this mask, drag it to the trash, and it's going to take it right back to where we were at. Now, when you delete masks, you will sometimes see that it's not going to let me brush here, of course, on the smart object. I'm going to explain that in a moment. When you delete a mask from a pixelized, from a rasterized layer, so I'll put a mask on here just to show you. It's going to ask you, there we go, I'll trash it. Oh, I already made that a smart object, forgot. So I'm going to rasterize that just for a moment. Apply my mask, use my mask, and then when I get rid of the mask from a rasterized layer, it will say, do you want to delete the mask? And delete the mask will get rid of the mask, but we'll go back to our normal image, or it will say apply. So essentially embedding that mask into the image. So in this case, I'm just going to delete. I don't want it to apply. So that happens on rasterized layers. So you can see the difference. You run into these little differences. Now I'm going to go back because I just want to make sure I'm back where we were supposed to be. There we are. And one thing you'll notice is that when you're trying to brush onto, so let's say I wanted to use my brush and I wanted to brush right onto this tree, or I wanted to use the clone stamp and clone out some of those spots. You can see it's not letting me. It's giving me a no. I'm not going to let you do it. Now if I did it to this layer, same thing, but when I rasterize that layer, then I can use the clone stamp and I can clean up those dots. So because that is a rasterized function, the clone is using rasterized aspects of Photoshop. So just be forewarned that sometimes you're going to be using smart objects, but you're not going to be able to do everything that Photoshop allows. And that's where you may have to convert a layer back to a rasterized layer, or just simply not go to a smart object in the first place. Okay, so we've made the copy, we added our blur, and we've given it a mask in order to, or we played with the mask in order to show through, do a little bit of show through between the layers. I'm going to turn this back on. We can adjust the opacity. So again, taking some of that harsh hit that this gave out. And now I'm on that layer. Again, I'm going to add what's called an adjustment layer. So an adjustment layer is, again, another way of working non-destructively. So I'll show you what I mean. In this case, I can go, because it's a smart object, I can go up to Image, Adjustments, Hue, Saturation, and it's going to add that in. and I can adjust, I can colorize, and we can see this can get pretty crazy. I can do that colorization and so on, and that will add in that hue saturation to that layer. I'll say okay. Now I can go back and adjust that if I want. Double click on it, make the necessary adjustments. It's editable, it's non-destructive. Now, what if I was doing that to a rasterized layer? So I would go to Forest. I'm going to rasterize this one again. So I'll rasterize the layer. Now, that's where when you're working on a rasterized layer, stay away from the image menu. Stay out of this stuff, because it's immediately doing destructive editing. If I go in and do hue saturation and I do the same thing, what it's doing is directly affecting that layer. I'm done. There's no going back. No way I can edit it. If I had a copy, that would be great, but I'm otherwise, I'm out of luck. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to undo that. And instead of doing it through the adjustments directly to the layer, with this rasterized layer, I'm going to add an adjustment layer. So that's here. So then I would go to hue saturation and watch what it does in my layers. So it puts one over top. So it's like a lens, a filter above my layer. So then when I go to colorize and I change this all around, and I'm being quite extreme here, but hopefully you wouldn't be that extreme with it. So I do that, and now if I wanted to, and I sent this to a client or something and they said, this looks ridiculous, can you please change it? I can say, yeah. I can go back, I can double click on it, I can edit how it interacts with the layer, I can go back to my properties and I can change the color again, or if I just don't know what I'm doing, I can get rid of that layer altogether. Okay, so whether you're working with smart objects or you're working with rasterized layers, you want to make sure you're working as non-destructively as possible. So I'm going to go right back, undo again to get myself back to where these are both smart objects. Okay, so I'll turn this back on, and we'll move on to the next step, and that's just grouping these now. So let's say I'm happy with my background. I'm gonna lighten this up a little bit. So what I'm gonna do is add, and you can still go here. You can add I'm gonna add a bright. I'll work on curves. So you can see it's still going to give me a curves layer. And I should mention, when you do that, when you add an adjustment layer, it's over top of everything below it, all aspects of your image work. So if I wanted that adjustment layer, I'll undo that. If I wanted that adjustment layer just to be applied to this area right here, I select that specific area, and then it will be applied to that area when I go and make that adjustment layer. So again, hue saturation, actually it was curves, but that's okay. So you can see now it's only going to apply to that area because that's the area I selected. Now I'll get rid of that, because what I actually want to do, I'm working with Smart Object, I'm going to go right up into here, into the image, and I want that to apply inside. I want to nest inside that layer. So I was going to do curves. There it is. And I'll make some adjustments here just to lighten it up a bit. Okay. There. So now I've got my background the way I want it, and if I wanted to change anything, I have endless ability to revise all of these. I can delete them if I need to, and edit and so on. So super helpful. So I'm going to hold Shift down. I've got this one selected. Hold Shift, select that one, and I'm going to click the folder. or I can just do Command G, and that will group them. And then I'll call that group background. Okay, so you can see when I said it doesn't take long to get a lot of layers, this is why. When you're working correctly with Photoshop, you're working non-destructively, and that's when your layers start to build up. So you want to isolate those. You want to know, okay, well, this is my background, and everything I need is in there. So now we'll move on to the next part, which is going to be getting the butterflies that we're going to bring into this.